Hello, and welcome to the Inclusive Hiring Practices for Candidates with Disabilities webinar. Our speakers today are Chet Cooper, founder and CEO of AbilityJOBS and Ability Magazine, and Melissa Dobbins, founder and CEO of Career.Place. And with that, I'll turn over to you, Chet.
Thank you, Gabe. As we are well aware, disability-based inclusion is and has been a struggle as a civil rights issue, as a moral issue, and as a legal issue. The ADA was passed in 1990, and after several struggles with the Supreme Court, which actually ruled against what the ADA meant to be, an example was a person with epilepsy was if they're taking medication and the seizures stopped, the Supreme Court had basically ruled and they're not protected under the ADA. So back in the bipartisan years, the Congress had another session, produced new law, which was called the ADA-AA, which then described for the courts specifically what disabilities means, beyond just a physical and mental impairment that substantially limits one or more activities. So basically the law described what a disability meant by this new ADA-AA: deafness, blindness, diabetes, cancer, autism, epilepsy, etc. So it allowed people to be under this protection of the ADA. One of the things that I think most people don't realize that the NIH actually states on average every person will experience one or more disabilities in their own lifetime. So that typically happens because of age. We're all aging as I speak right now, and it's become the largest minority in the country, fastest growing minority in the country. And you need to look at the idea that it's not just them, those people, or someone that's in a different community. It really affects us all. And as we like to look at it, it's part of the fabric of life. There's also this concept of TAB, temporarily able-bodied, where at any moment and any time, somebody could become, to have a disability. We look at also the idea that just because you have a disability doesn't mean you don't have ability. So in the next frame, we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of disabilities as a benefit to, let's say it's the carrot, that when you employ people with disabilities, there are many studies that exist out there that show that productivity, morale, positive perception, employers, both buyers and employees, change the attitudes. There's an actual financial benefit to hiring people with disabilities and having part of the workforce. Richard Marriott is famously known to say, it's just not the right thing. It's just not the right thing to do, but it's good business. So companies that are looking to increase their bottom line, their profit, hiring people with disabilities is actually good business. So we're gonna have a quick survey here.
Alrighty, there is a poll that you guys are going to see in a moment. There are 2 questions in this poll. Like I said before, all answers will be kept anonymous. So it's, do you have a disability? And the second question is, do you have at least one team member in your organization with a disability? We'll keep this up for about the next 30 seconds. Like I mentioned, we'll be sharing the results at the end. So Chet, let's continue.
So for many people listening and many companies in the United States, if you're a federal contractor or subcontractor, meaning 50 or more employees and 50,000 in contracts to the government, then there's the first part was the carrot being benefits to hiring people with disabilities. The second part, this might be considered the stick. The stick being there's a law that basically says you need to do some things to comply. Of course, as most of us know, within this area, there's a goal of 7% of your workforce having disabilities. And the idea here is that we're looking to increase the number of people with disabilities, both in the side of the government saying if people become taxpayers rather than on SSI or SSDI, then they become, instead of a debit, they become an asset. So it literally shifts the economy of the country when President Bush signed the ADA, he said there was an $800 billion benefit to signing this law. So the law was a bipartisan law. So from this point, we're looking at the next slide. We're going to talk about some of the issues that are going on, why we still have a problem of hiring people with disabilities. I think one of the main issues here is this unconscious bias that we all have that exists. We have unconscious bias for all types of things. And disability, I think, is one of the rarest, most unique things that I can ever think of, in the sense that we use the word disability, meaning it doesn't function. So if you have the definition of disability, meaning it doesn't function, and yet we are here in a webinar talking about hiring people with disabilities, there's a disconnect in our minds. There's this bias that occurs. So every day we are bombarded with the concept of disability, meaning it doesn't work. In sports, the athlete is on the disabled list. If you're listening to the radio and you're driving to work, there's a traffic problem. There's a disabled vehicle blocking the traffic. When you fly, you listen to the announcement: do not tamper or disable the smoke detector. On the employment side, this person's on disability leave. They have disability insurance. Even on our programs for software, if you want to turn something off, it says click here to disable this application. Constantly we're hearing the word disability, meaning it doesn't work. And yet here we are today talking about hire people with disabilities. So it's okay to be confused. It's a little frustrating that this confusion is continuous throughout the day. But if you look back and think of how the first time you heard about hiring a person with disability, you might even remember there was something going on there. What's happening? We don't have much time, but I want a quick side note. One of our nonprofit programs, we build houses with Habitat for Humanity. We use volunteers as the core of building the house. People with disabilities building houses for families with disabilities. We went to a Habitat affiliate. We had meeting after meeting. At one point, one of the people within the meeting literally said to us, "Wait a minute, I thought we were being punked. You're having people with disabilities building homes." So even though we've had programs where we built houses across the country, there's still this disconnect with the word disability. So from here, we're gonna move on, and Melissa's now gonna take over and talk a little bit more about what this webinar is about.
So because there's a stigma for people with disabilities, as Chet was talking about, it means that many people with disabilities are not included. They're not employed. We can start by looking at the unemployment rate. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we all know right now that unemployment rate is low. It's around 3.3% for people who have not identified as having a disability, and over double at 7% for people who do. The over double is concerning, but the numbers are still low, unless you take a broader view. Because what's not shown in these numbers is all of the people who have never identified as being unemployed. So either they were never employed in the first place, didn't take unemployment when they stopped working, or otherwise hasn't told the government that they are an unemployed adult. So if you take a look at the bigger picture, the numbers are far more stark. So while people without disabilities that are adult of working age make up about 23%, those with disabilities are up at 68%. That is a large problem. And the good news is we are doing things to solve it. We are making progress as organizations. There are things like awareness training to show employers what to do, how to do it with people with disabilities or any other area of diversity. Affirmative action plans in making sure that there's at least some efforts going on to employ a certain percentage. There are even programs out there for designated positions. I am only going to hire people who are on the autism scale in order to fill this position in quality control, for example. And those are great. Those are progress. Those are addressing the symptoms. They are not removing the underlying problems, those stigmas, those exclusionary practices that are keeping those with disabilities away from the job market and not competitive for the jobs that they could be fantastic at. In order to change the way we're fundamentally doing this and being more inclusive, we have to start by shifting the way we're thinking about the problem. It's not just about chasing numbers. It's not just about feeling good and involving more people and putting them off to a side somewhere. It's about adopting more fair and inclusive hiring practices so that anybody and everybody who is good for the job, including those with disabilities, have a fair and equal shot for that position and for the job market. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of this conversation. Now, it's a huge conversation, talking about how to be more inclusive across the hiring process. So we are going to just take a few pieces of it during the course of the conversation during this webinar. And there's always more materials, more conversations to be had afterwards. So consider this the tip of the iceberg. But even in this, we are going to go from defining the job all the way to onboarding and provide examples and tips and techniques to be more inclusive for those with disabilities. Now, before we really dive in, I want to take a moment to talk about self-identification. That is when employers give candidates, employees, anyone the opportunity to self-identify as having a disability or needing an accommodation. Throughout this process, from the moment a candidate hits the apply button all the way to onboarding and beyond, you should be thinking about ways to allow anybody and everybody to self-identify. The key here is to always be fair. Never, ever, ever hand someone you think has a disability the opportunity to self-identify. Always make it for everybody, and those who have them can then feel free to or not to identify themselves. There are many things you can do here. Some examples include providing a form to everyone and making it accessible to everyone. So whether it's on a website or a stack of papers at the front door or whatever it is, if it's accessible to everyone in every type of interaction that you have from candidates all the way to onboarding and beyond, you're providing a fair and equal opportunity for self-identification. Other things you can do is defining a process for reasonable accommodations. If you have a candidate coming up to somebody in your hiring team and self-identifying, and that person looks back at them like a deer in headlights, like, oh boy, now what do I do? That is not an inclusive experience. You don't want to feel like you're tripped up because somebody has done something as natural as self-identifying. So everyone who's involved in that process, just give them the next steps. What should they do? Who should they contact? How should they react? The more that they're equipped to have that conversation or know what to do when someone self-identifies, the better the experience for the candidates, the more inclusive the environment becomes. And always demonstrate a welcoming environment. It should always be comfortable and safe for any applicant, for any candidate, for anybody who's onboarding, for any employee to self-identify at any time. A couple of things to stay away from: never, ever, ever force disclosure. That is illegal. It is uncomfortable. It is a horrible experience. Do not point blank ask. Do not force people to fill out a form. Do not make it a required field if you have a disability unless one of the responses is I choose not to answer. Also, be very wary about follow-up questions. You cannot, for example, if someone has a medical disability, ask about medical history, medical needs, expenses. All of that is illegal and protected. So just be careful with how you follow up, what you say, what you can't say. It must be relevant to the position and being within the organization. That is why training is an excellent thing to do, so everyone knows what they can and can't say when somebody does come forward. So now let's dive a little bit further into the details, starting with defining the job. Now, we all know there are many things that go into successfully defining a job so that you can engage with potential applicants, encourage them to hit that apply button, and find your great talent. Everything from having a clear descriptive description all the way to being deliberate, so what you are saying is exactly what you mean, accurate and realistic. But if you do this wrong, then what you can end up doing is creating a description, creating that first interaction that screams, I don't belong, for those with disabilities. So you have to be very careful with how you're even positioning the job, how you're describing the culture, how you're setting up the requirements in order to resonate with the widest audience you can that is still meaningful for the job that you're trying to fill. So there's lots of ways to do this. This is a huge topic within itself. So we're just going to focus on one for now, and that's the culture. We will also be talking about requirements a little bit later in this presentation. So when crafting that culture statement, let's start with the easy thing to talk about. What is culture not? Culture is not a specific personality. So when you're crafting this statement to describe to your candidates or your potential candidates what your culture is, be wary of anything that looks like, this is the type of personality we like to work with, this is the type of person I get along with. That's not only is that not going to help, it's going to alienate people. Make sure it's not an ideal version of the truth, it is the actual truth. There's a very easy test for this. If you do not believe your own culture statement, probably not a realistic version of the truth. And most importantly for this conversation, the culture is not picnic parties and ping pong tables. That's a bunch of what? The culture is the why. And we'll get in a moment to why that's so important when talking about inclusion for people with disabilities. But just to shift the framework, when crafting a culture statement, stick to the mission, the values, and the real organization experiences. The mission, anyone and everyone who would be great in your organization can get behind it and be excited by it. It's the simplicity of why does this organization exist? What are you there to change, to affect? Values are all the things that drive real decisions and behaviors, not what we say changes behaviors, but from the C-suite down, what actually impacts how the organization functions. And organizations experiences how we behave day to day. For example, it's not if you have a ping pong table, it's what your organization does with the ping pong table. So how does this culture statement affect those with disabilities as they're evaluating whether this is the right job, the right organization for them? Well, imagine some fairly common culture statements talking about happy hours and holiday parties, or working hard and playing hard, highly competitive go-getters. These are fairly common phrases. But looking at it through a different lens, happy hours and holiday parties, that talks a lot to extroversion and people who are very comfortable in social situations. It also talks to a distinct type of personality. What if the individual can't drink or won't drink, for example? Working hard, playing hard, highly competitive go-getters. These are very physical, action-oriented types of languages. It could put off people who have physical disabilities. So when you're picking when you're selecting your culture statements, think about how those terms are going to resonate and if it is exactly what you mean, or if you're just using language that's common, that people use all the time, that sounds exciting. Go for what you really mean, those mission, the value, the things that really get people excited about working for you. Not about their personality or their habits or their comfort level in external social situations or how physically active they are. And now to turn it over to Chet to talk about sourcing candidates.
Thank you, Melissa. So one of the questions comes up on a regular basis is how do you find and source candidates with disabilities? So the first one is the typical job board. The job boards that exist today are basically aggregators. They pool a lot of material into one large bin. The history of job boards online. The first employment website was Career Mosaic. Career Mosaic was bought out by Headhunter. Headhunter is bought out by Career Builder. But all of these job boards aggregate. The big ones, Indeed and ZipRecruiter, they're just massive machines that just gather data from everywhere. And with that, you don't have the number of people with disabilities in there, and if not, and also they're not identified. As Melissa was talking about, self-identification is an important part, especially if you're dealing with Section 503. So the next place to go if you're looking to source would be maybe universities and colleges. Universities and colleges oftentimes have career placements for students with disabilities out of the Student Disability Services Centers. Not all of them have that. Some of them are set up more for accommodation for the students and not necessarily for the recruitment part. But they're definitely, you should look into them. They're a great resource for young talent. Advocacy organizations, which could be nonprofits that exist, ranging from Easter Seals to UCP. These organizations oftentimes have in place some component that helps companies look to identify people with disabilities. They're not necessarily their mission statements, but oftentimes they're sources. Community outreach, a good example, also could be included in some social media within that community outreach. And then it comes to specialty job boards. Specialty job boards, or basically what AbilityJOBS has done. We created the first job board, even though we had partnered with Career Mosaic in 1995. It became obvious to us that they were just an aggregator throwing all the resumes we received for people with disabilities into one big pool. And then when Headhunter bought them and Career Builder came along, all of them are aggregators, and they just assimilate as many resumes as possible, so you lose the identity. So specialty job boards are specific for a group. For us, it's people with disabilities are the only ones within our resume bank, only ones that companies are looking to hire. So specialty job boards are basically the easiest way to tap into qualified people with disabilities.
So I think it might be worth taking a quick note that if you are looking at just common job boards and you're thinking about more inclusive ways to engage with people with disabilities, on average, common job boards have somewhere around a 5% rate of applicants with people with disabilities or applicants with disabilities, even though if you look at the percentage of people on, as a whole, it's closer to 25%. So it's hugely underrepresented for what the population actually has, which is why it's so important to continue down that list and look for alternate sources, especially when you're trying to increase the number of people with disabilities you're engaging with in order to employ. And then from a passive standpoint, so if going through job boards is all about looking for active candidates and those candidates that come to you, there's also a lot of programs and a lot of companies will go after passive candidates, whether it's internal or working through staffing or recruiting companies. When doing that, be careful with your wish list. Because if, let's say, for example, you tend to favor, or you're having the recruiters, the staffing companies, searching for individuals with certain backgrounds and traits, like coming from a specific company or going to a specific school, because you favor those candidates, just know that you are inheriting the demographic distribution of what you're targeting. So if I only hire people from Acme Corp, then if Acme Corp does not employ people with disabilities, guess what's happening to that passive candidate pool? So just be aware of what you're asking for under the surface as you engage in your passive candidate search. Also, take into account a couple of things that affect some groups, such as people with disabilities, over others. For example, title inflation. people with disabilities, just like other protected classes, women, minorities, tend to get promoted at much lesser rates, which means if you're only looking for, let's say, VP or above or director and above titles, you might be accidentally pinching the pool of people with disabilities because you're just not going to find them at the same level as other individuals. So if you focus more on the skills and on the experiences rather than the titles, it will allow you to open up that pool a little bit more. So moving on to qualifying candidates, which is one of my personal favorite topics. Let's take a look at an organizational structure for qualifying candidates to focus the conversation. So assume your candidates go through a funnel. You're probably starting with some sort of minimum requirements, making sure they just hit the bare minimum to even be worth a consideration. Then you might go through some sort of assessment or soft skill trait evaluation. Then more of a deep dive to make sure that they can do the job. How do they approach those positions? How do they approach the challenges and the problems and the day-to-day of the role? And then finally, are they going to fit with the team, with the organization? Are they going to be a great culture fit, culture add to the organization? So if we take that concept and step through one at a time, we can start with the minimum requirements. Now, when you're creating the minimum requirements in a universal way, they of course must be clear, which means people have to know what you're asking for. They must be measurable. Did those individuals, are those applicants actually, do they actually have what you're looking for? Can you measure it? It must be realistic. This one is surprisingly difficult for a lot of organizations. There's a quick check here. If you're asking for a laundry list of requirements, look around your organization at the people who used to hold the job or who hold similar jobs. If no one in that organization meets the same requirements that you have for the open position at the same level of pay, at the same title, they might not be realistic. They, of course, also have to be defendable. This is super important from a compliance standpoint, from a legal standpoint, because if you cannot easily defend why it's a requirement, you're opening yourself up for liability. And of course, they must be a true must-have. That is the core definition of minimum requirements, is it's a minimum requirement to do the job. So let's take a look at what would happen with a requirement that might lean you in the wrong direction, but it's fairly common. Must be able to stand for 8 hours a day at a conference. We've seen this requirement. I'm sure you've seen this requirement. There's a little bit of a problem here. It is clear, absolutely. I know what I have to do. I know how long I have to do it. It's measurable. You could even test by having someone stand up for 8 hours. It's realistic. There are plenty of people out there that can do it. But is it defendable? Because if you have a physical disability, let's say you're in a wheelchair or you have to sit down for periods of time, does that mean you're not accomplishing the job? If this is a job for someone in marketing who's at a conference to represent your brand, can they really not do it unless they're standing up? Is that truly defendable? Because in most cases, the answer is probably no. In which case, it's also not a must-have. Requirements like these cause problems for people with disabilities. They are not inclusive. But a slight change can make all the difference. Must be able to interact with people for 8 hours a day at a conference. They're there to sell. They're there to represent the brand. They're not there to stand up. So now you can evaluate with these minimum requirements someone who can do the job you need them to do while being far more inclusive. Moving on to that second step, those soft skill traits, which are often done using assessments, evaluated using assessments. This is a huge topic within itself. So rather than going through it all, Let's just focus on the piece that matters the most for this topic at hand, for people with disabilities, and that's accessibility. When evaluating, selecting, using assessments as part of the hiring process, keep a few things in mind in order to be fully accessible and therefore inclusive to people with disabilities. First of all, can all your candidates actually take the assessment? If they're physical assessments, paper and pen type of assessments, is the location physically accessible? If it's digital, can people with different disabilities, let's say a mobility disability, be able to answer them? Can they get through the assessments? Also, do your assessments measure what you intend them to measure? For example, time limits. There are a lot of assessments out there with time limits. But what if your candidate is dyslexic and can't read quickly? What if they have a mobility disability and they can't move quickly? Are you testing what you think you're testing with those time limits? Another one that often kind of sneaks through the cracks is color codes. We're very used to green is good, red is bad. So when you're doing assessments, click the green bubble, the red bubble. But people who are colorblind, green-red is an extremely common version of colorblind, which means they can't see the difference. An easy test for this is test all your interfaces on grayscale. If you can see the differences in grayscale and take the assessment, you're probably good from a color perspective. Once you're done with the soft skills, that next piece is that deep dive, the scenarios, the situational questions. And much like the requirements, these need to be clear. Your candidates need to know what you're asking about. They need to be measurable. Did your candidate have a good or bad answer? How good or bad was it compared to other candidates? And they need to be applicable. Being able to answer this question well means that there is a higher probability they will be successful at the job. But again, doing these incorrectly can create unnecessary exclusion for people with disabilities. And I'm going to give you an example of something that has actually happened to me, where I had an interview, and part of it was doing a whiteboard pitch to sell a solution. Makes sense. My job was to be able to, in any situation, represent the brand and the company. And you're not always going to have all your pitch materials with you. I might not have had a slide deck, or it might have been during a conference where I'm sitting on the side. Can I use a whiteboard and pitch the solution without any prep? Here's the problem with the whiteboard. It has no spell check. So if you're somebody with dyslexia, it could put you at a big disadvantage. Whiteboards also usually are attached to something at some level. So if somebody is in a wheelchair or otherwise cannot reach the whiteboard, they might not be able to achieve this task either. So while it is clear and measurable, it's not necessarily applicable. But again, a very slight pivot can make a world of difference. Pitch a solution without preparation using visuals. Doesn't actually need to be a whiteboard, does it? Maybe I have an iPad that I can use to draw my images. Maybe it's a pen and paper at a desk. But if I can achieve the goal of pitching the solution without preparation and having some sort of visual action, haven't I met the requirement? And it's far more inclusive. And then finally, with that fit for culture. So with that, again, very similar. It's got to be insightful. Don't test for things that don't matter. It's got to be measurable, what's good, what's bad, and it's got to be applicable. And as a quick reminder from an earlier conversation, culture is mission, value, organization, experience. It is not if I like you or if you're like me. So let's concentrate on applicable. There are a lot of things that individuals and organizations will tend to use under this big umbrella, under this guise of fit for culture, which are very problematic for those with disabilities. For example, you've probably heard, I like to find a person that makes strong eye contact or with a firm handshake. Well, those don't make very much sense if the individuals that you're interviewing are blind or have a disability, a mobile disability, or even if they're on the autism scale. There are many reasons why an individual might not make eye contact with you or might not have a firm handshake that have nothing to do with the capabilities of the individual. So avoid any of those cues that might trigger your comfort level, but they aren't actually helping in evaluating the candidate and if that candidate is going to be good for your organization. And then finally, as you're going through this process, as you're going through your process to evaluate candidates, one trick can make a world of difference. And that is use anonymity as much as possible. Imagine what would happen if those candidates are anonymous as they're going through the process. Because as soon as that happens, not only is that enforcing compliance, everyone truly is treated the same way by the same standards, but it's also reducing the biases, maybe those handshakes or eye contacts. They're removed, they're off the table. You're not getting distracted by them. And therefore, you're forced to pivot, and it promotes objective decisions. You've predefined this is what I need, and this is why, and then you're measuring against that. And it also avoids the mirror effect of looking for people who are just like you. So that puts everyone on a level playing field, those with disabilities, those without, so you can find the best candidates. And now for interviews and onboarding with Chet.
Thank you. So interviews are really important when it comes to the accessibility components of the materials, the location. The EEOC just recently is moved up their game in litigations. I'm not going to go into all the companies they've sued just recently, but it happens more around an interview process where a person happens to be deaf. They ask for a sign language interpreter, and the people, the recruiters on the end, are so not prepared that they literally have said things like, well, we can't interview you right now, and not give them the job. They hire other people. EEOC has been very aggressive. If you actually go to AbilityMagazine.com and type in EEOC as a search, you'll see the different articles. The reality then is you need to make sure your recruiters understand that people with disabilities might be coming in, and different disabilities will need different compliance issues, different accommodations. Think about the simplest of things of an accessible restroom. Stairs, of course, are a real difficulty if you're having a location that might not even be in your office. There was a situation just recently where I saw the same thing happen as Melissa was giving an anecdotal as a personal experience. I'm with an actor. They're going to audition. They wanted me to come along, get into the elevator to where the audition is going. The person I'm with is in a wheelchair, cannot even reach the button to the floor of where this audition is occurring. So they're trying to audition actors with disabilities, but they're not even having an accessible location for people that might be using wheelchairs. So think about those locations, think about low traffic, think about a quiet area to speak with. You have a lot of different components that can be looked at. That askjan.org is a really great website that if you have any questions, they've been around for many, many years. They're at a Department of Labor is sponsoring this initiative. West Virginia University is the backbone for making this happen, but askjan.org is a wonderful place to look at all the different needs and accommodations for interviewing process. So the next stage we're going to go to, because we're running a little bit short on time, is onboarding. Now, onboarding is a really, you should really think of onboarding as an investment in performance for your company. If you're not doing onboarding in a proper way, you're really potentially missing out. 1/3 of employees quit within the first 6 months. So if you haven't created an environment that feels comfortable and to the new employees, then you have some real issues that could occur down the line. And it's very expensive, as we all know, to hire a new person and get them trained, get them up to speed, and then all of a sudden they leave. So you have to be very cautious of how you do this. One of the tricks that I think might really help when it comes to hiring people with disabilities, and maybe just anyone in general, there's always this awkwardness when you're coming into a new job. If you can put them together with someone else within your company, let's call them a work buddy, and they will be there to help with any of those questions. Sometimes the questions seem a little silly, so they don't want to say it in front of HR. So having someone within the company that can work with that new hire makes a lot of sense. So whenever possible, think about onboarding as an investment within your own company to keep the people that you're hiring on board. Think about locations. For example, we're talking about accessibility within the location that they're going to work. Is that a friendly environment? Is the parking in a place that makes it easier for a person that might need accessible parking? And is the building, the bathroom, the workspace? An example of service animals. If there's a service animal, think about the other people around that might be working near that workstation. If there is, let's say, a seeing eye dog, are the people around them, have you notified them and asked, are you allergic to dogs? Is there something that you could do to accommodate the workspace in such a way that if a service animal is coming in, that there isn't going to be a problem with other people within the space? Technology. Bottom line is you could always ask the person. That's the other thing you should always think about. If you're in question, have a question, just ask. It's that simple, really. So technology is the space that they're working in. Does it have the necessary tools? Do they need drag and dictate? Do they need some other software to connect with whatever the work they're doing? So these materials all should be looked at and asked to the new employee. What can we do to accommodate to make sure that anything of your needs are met? And then the last one about accommodating emergency plans. An emergency plan is also often one of the last things you think about when it comes to people with disabilities within the workplace. But FEMA and other organizations have been working very hard to figure out different strategies during whatever the emergency might be, whether it's an earthquake, a fire, etc. So think about those things on onboarding and provide those materials to that new employee that makes them feel comfortable that you've thought this thing through prior to hiring, that it's a friendly environment, that you're there together, and that you're building this family of employees that are there to work together and not make them feel like a token hire, that it's part of the core of the culture of the company itself. So those are quite important aspects within the onboarding process. So we're wrapping up now, and just to remember, we all have these unconscious biases. So try to do your best to eliminate that, as Melissa mentioned, that anonymous is a great way to approach these things. One of the things the reason we're working together with Career.Place is our job board, for example, has tens of thousands of job seekers with disabilities. But how cool would it be if they funnel it into a place and you don't even know what the disability is and you're just hiring for the talent? So remember to go to places like askjan.org. You can visit AbilityJOBS.com. We also have Ability Job Fair, the first online career fair, which is a a place that you don't have to worry about hiring a sign language interpreter. It's already built into the program. And again, visit AbilityMagazine.com to learn more about the EEOC, with some of the things that they've been doing so that you don't get in trouble with legal issues around accommodations and recruiting and the interview process.
And if you'd like to have any more information about other areas of diversity and inclusion, Career.Place, we cover materials across the board, from how to write a great job description, to the art of selecting assessments, to weekly tips to increase inclusivity around the hiring process. And these are fantastic conversations. We love sharing any material, any information that we have. So please come and visit us, and you're welcome to our white papers, our blogs. And if you have any other ideas, I'd love to hear them. What do you want to know about? Thank you very much. So now we would like to open up, and it'd be great if it went in the right direction. We would like to open up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Chet. That was fantastic. Before we go into questions, I promised to share with you the results of our poll. So we had the 2 questions. Do you have a disability? Results from that, from the folks who participated in the poll, was 34% yes. So 1/3, just over 1/3 of the folks on this webinar itself have said they have a disability. And if you have at least one team member in your organization with a disability, 85%. So a very large percentage of you have said that. So I thought that was pretty interesting and lines up well with what we just discussed. So if you haven't, if you thought of a question, you haven't written it down yet, go ahead to that Q&A section in the Zoom panel. If you just go over that screen, you'll see, I believe it's in the bottom, maybe it's on the top, I'm not sure. It's a little box called Q&A, and type your question in place over there. And we do have a couple of questions that came up. So Chet and Melissa, you guys are both unmuted right now. Question is, can you ask someone who is coming in for an on-site interview if they need any accommodations so that you can prepare in advance? I'll let one of you guys answer.
I can answer that.
Sure.
Yes, you could always ask if someone needs an accommodation. And I think it's a great question because it brings up a potential issue around self-disclosure. So a lot of people don't want to self-disclose, which is fine, it's a prerogative. But if they need an accommodation, they will have to self-disclose because that's part of the ADA. And so, yes, you could ask someone if they need an accommodation.
And a great way to approach this is, if you ask everybody, then you don't need to worry about it. So like we talked about with allowing for people to self-identify, if it's just part of the process, then it's part of the process. Everyone has the same opportunity, because what you don't want to do is single people out.
Right, great. Okay, next question we have in place here is, where can I go to improve the flow of candidates with disabilities? And I think, Chet, you talked about some of this earlier.
Sure. I mean, I don't want this to be a infomercial, but you have the universities, you have organizations dealing with disabilities, and of course, the first and largest job board is AbilityJOBS.com. So take a look at that and see what you think. And then the career fair coming up July 25th that we're having. We have companies, large companies, small companies, nonprofits, governments, they all have worked with us in helping them recruit qualified people with disabilities, ranging from entry level to PhDs, from the mailroom to the boardroom. So, so take a look at those things.
Great. We, and just also one more time, so if you have any questions, please write them in there. We have one more question here. Oh, good question. How would you incorporate training for HR professionals and managers on the fact that major depressive disorder is a recognized disability? I suspect statistics would jump up even higher if candidates weren't afraid to speak up. Stigma is a huge issue. It's a great point.
You know, one of the things that has been really effective across a lot of diversity angles, so groups, whether it's people with disabilities or any other diversity group that gets discussed, is to switch the conversation to what does it mean? So if you can create, or at least start that conversation with, why does it matter as an organization? For example, what are the types of things that would be accommodations for this group, and how can, as an organization, can you facilitate the best environments and ways for every individual, including those with major depressive disorder, to thrive in the environment, because that's what every organization needs, whether you're a nonprofit or a Fortune 500 or anything in between. The more your employees thrive in an environment, the more you're able to generate or to reach your goal, to generate profits, revenue. That is what we all need. So if you wrap the conversation like that, that's a great way to open the door. And then the training can go from, and here's what we can do about it, to the other aspects of awareness. And it's been a really effective way to start conversations around any area of diversity, including those with disabilities, is the so what first, and then back up into the what.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Chet. At this point, I don't see any other questions. So thank you all for attending this webinar. Like I mentioned earlier, this webinar is recorded, and I will be emailing you guys information how to access the recording if you wanted to watch this later. And we also, like I mentioned, if you sat through this webinar, you will, and you have a SHRM accreditation, you will be receiving a SHRM accreditation certificate for the 1 credit you can apply to. If you have any issues with that, you can email me. This is Gabe Gurman. You'll see the email coming from me with the certificate. Just reply back to me if you have any issues. So with that, I wish you guys a terrific rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us.